Thank you. It's a pleasure. First Republic Day, and I thank Think India for giving me the opportunity to speak on the constitutional journey of India. Now, what has been India's constitutional journey? Now, if we have to address that question, I think it's most important that we first address what is a constitution. What is a constitution? Constitution, we discuss so much about it. We discuss so much about constitutional values. We discuss so much about constitutionalism. But what exactly is a constitution? A lot of us assume that constitution is a book. Constitution is a text which we go and refer back to. But is constitution merely a text? Or is constitution more or less an agreement which people arrive, which they sort of agree that their future is going to be governed in terms of that agreement? If we see all over the world that a written text is not necessary for a constitution. There have been, like the British Constitution and the New Zealand Constitution to an extent, there have been large amount of flexibility granted into that. There is a reason for it. For example, in the British Constitution, it's not in a constitution does not exist in a single written text, but it exists in a large number of laws. And it is the courts, previously the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court of Britain, which culls out what is the constitutional law from these different texts and what are the constitutional values from these different laws, and then interprets different laws to say whether they are in terms of the accepted constitution of the country. Second, how does a constitution happen? Now, there are very many ways which a constitution can happen. In America, after the War of Independence, a large number of people who had fought for their independence from Britain got together in Philadelphia, debated on the Constitution, and then came out with a constitutional document inspired by the ideas of those times. While, let's say, in a country like Britain, which has a large history and which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years before the single framing of the Constitution, it was the Constitution which is today taken to be the Constitution of Britain is a product of its historical experiences. Now the question is, what are its historical experiences? The historical experiences and of different countries are completely different. The historical experiences of, let's say, someone like Japan and someone like America and someone like Britain are completely different. And this is especially, and I will refer to this later as I go through this talk, especially relevant for a country like us, India, because our experiences of history are fundamentally different from different countries of the world. Now, what is the unique nature of the Constitution in India? Now, what are our historical experiences which makes us different from America, which makes us different from Britain? Now, I'll illustrate it. I think it's easier for us to understand if we illustrate it. In America, the Constitution of America arose out of the context that 13 colonies, which were primarily settled by people from Britain, decided to break away on the question of taxes, no taxation without representation. They were deeply influenced by ideas which came from Britain because they agreed with it. It was only the question of whether they should be governed directly from Britain and to what extent their rights of the people, of the colonists in America, would be invaded or could be invaded by the British government. As a result, after the War of Independence, they all sat down together and they discussed as what would be the best government. They also had to take into account that there were 13 different colonies. As a result, how was the power to be shared? They also had to take into account that the people had fought against what they considered the invasion of their private life, of their freedom of speech and expression, as to what would be the established religion of Britain. Even today, the Constitution of Britain allows that the Lord Spiritual, which are, this is our 71st, 70 years after our independence, 71st from 1950 onwards. Now, can we have a constitution? Or can we have an interpretation of the Constitution which does not take into account the experiences which we had, which led up to the Constitution framing? Now, can we talk about a Constitution which does not take into account the 1935 Government of India Act, which was framed by the British, leading up to the framing of our Constitution? Can we have a Constitution and an interpretation of the Constitution which does not take into account the entire question of the Round Table Conferences and the entire struggle for partition and the entire struggle for rights of the people against princely states? All this led up to the framing of our Constitution. They were foundational as to how we framed our Constitution. Now let's, as an example, say what are some of the major keynotes of our Constitution. And I'll give you the text and background of why they're very, very unique in India, as very different from the rest of the world. One is the question of, a hotly debated topic of secularism. Now, we all know in America, secularism means a Chinese wall between the church and the state. In India, we term it as Sarva Dharma Samabhav. Now, where is the history of Sarva Dharma Samabhav? Sarva Dharma Samabhav, the Supreme Court has always referred, is the text which says, treat all religions equally. There is both a context of it, because Supreme Court refers to the Upanishads while referring to this, as well as there is a background. The background is that in 1857, after our first war of independence, when the country was taken over directly by the British in 1858, the first item in Queen Victoria's declaration that she would treat all religions equally, because there was, in that context, before that, during the time of the British East India Company, a large amount of attempted conversion, and the grouse of the people was that because of this large amount of attempted conversion, some religions were being treated in a superior manner, and there was an attempted interference in the religion of everybody else. The next point, let us now discuss the concept of socialism. Now, can we ever discuss the concept of socialism without the discussion of the Karachi Congress or the socialist struggle of establishing a socialist society which went on in the Congress? I don't think that is possible, because we have our own unique, the first formation of the Planning Commission and how it panned out, what sort of industrial model we should follow, and which led up to, in its own way, the Bombay Plan. How can we disregard all these issues, which preceded the formation of the Constitution, and which in many ways was the subtext of the constitutional model? Now let us take another very important keynote, republicanism or democracy. Now, can we talk about this republicanism and democracy that we talk about today as an integral part of the Indian Constitution without discussing the struggle for universal franchise, without discussing the struggle against separate electorates, without discussing the struggle against different Rajas and Maharajas, against princely states? Now, for us to come to what is the Indian constitutional law, we have to discuss all these issues, which get finally manifested in the constitution. Now, let's take another issue. What about social justice? Now, of course, in India, there has been a huge movement for social justice, of Baba Sahib's movement for social justice, of Swami Vivekananda speaking so much in detail about social justice. These were the subtext on which the constitution was framed. Can we ever say that we can disregard these things, that we can disregard these issues while trying to interpret the constitution? Now let's discuss fundamental rights. Our fundamental rights are fundamentally framed differently from those of America and those from Britain. The reason is because there was, for each of these fundamental rights issues, there was a huge struggle and there was a large amount of political compromise which went underneath the framing of these constitutional parameters. For example, the question of religion. There was that huge debate in the Constituent Assembly, and which had a huge historical background as well, is where is the right to propagate? While certain religions stressed the fact that they had the right to propagate and that was the basis of their religion, others said very clearly that they could not. And that is why there was a restriction placed on the right to religion in the Constitution. What about the specific right of sects to practice their own religion, sections of religions to practice their own religion? This is unique in India because it does not seem like it exists anywhere else in the world. But we know in India that as a fundamental right, we have a very diverse religion where every religion has different sections which practice that religion differently. So we have to incorporate that in the Constitution. Now, that is not reflected in the Constituent Assembly debates, but it's reflected in the heritage and the lead up to how we frame the Constitution. Let's say even something like equality. Our equality is greatly nuanced because we believe that you have to treat equals as equals and unequals as unequals. Because there is this huge struggle against untouchability, which was the contribution of Baba Sahib, who stressed the fact that we should have an equal constitution where those who have been disadvantaged and who have been disadvantaged over thousands of years should be treated differently. We incorporated that in our constitution. We incorporated right against untouchability in our constitution. So to that extent, again, this was a huge and completely different from every other constitution in the world. Now, even our freedoms are to that extent intricately balanced. They are subject to public order because we know that we live in a volatile country. People say lots of things. People get hurt very easily. This is unique. And this is not because people in the Constituent Assembly discussed this. This is because, or they thought about it, but this is because it results as a continuous process of this country, of its lived life as who we are. Now, all of us know this entire principles of directive principle state policy. We also know that there are various principles on directive principle state policy, from those that the government should have control of the means of production, the provisions on cow slaughter, the provisions against the banning of cow slaughter, the provisions for a uniform civil code. We had all that because these are unique products of our constitutional journey. There was no doubt a political compromise, but there was also a question that this was not only decided at the time of the Constituent Assembly or by the constitutional framers. It was a product of a period of time. Now, even the question of federalism, which we are so proud of. Now, can we talk about federalism without discussing the British experiment of the provincial list system, which it first came out in the 1935 Act, now which was first experimented with in Canada, or the Supreme Court. Now, we all know that Muhammad Ali Jinnah really fought for having a Supreme Court in India. He was one of the proponents who really pushed for that idea. And we had to, because every case otherwise was decided at the Privy Council in Britain. To have an Indian court, there was a huge struggle. Now, all of these struggles, this is what I want to say, all of these struggles happened outside the Constituent Assembly. Therefore, the Constitution as we see it is a product of various different struggles which were reflected in the Constitution. Constitution did not create a new polity. The polity wrote down the Constitution at that period of time based upon its experiences. The Constitution, therefore, was not in that nature as a transformative Constitution, that the people's slate had been made clean, but it was a process of continuum of the experiences of the people, who at a certain point of time had to frame the basic underlying values and laws for a new state that they were creating. So they put in place these boundaries over which they expected the state to follow, and if need be, to amend as it went along. Now, therefore, there are whole loads of people who talk about how to interpret the Constitution. Some say you treat the Constitution like a holy book. Others, and even I would say Baba Saheb Ambedkar, did not want it that way. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, in that very famous speech which we all are fond of talking and discussing, said very clearly that I don't want the Constitution to be packed with values, because the values of this generation may not be the values of the people in future. And who are we of this generation to bind the values of today over the people in the future? As Thomas Jefferson famously said and famously proposed, that every constitution should be limited to 20 years, because he believed that only a generation could bind itself and could not bind anyone else. So in conclusion, I would only say this, that the constitutionalism which we should believe is a constitutionalism which is not transformative in nature, but it is a continuum of our culture. The Constitution represents the best of our culture, but it is not written in stone. We should be willing to interpret the Constitution in the context of our culture. The Constitution does not create our culture. It is our culture which has created our Constitution. Jai Hind, Bharat Mata ki Jai.